Did you ever wonder who Cleopatra really was? Was she a brilliant ruler who fought to save her kingdom, or a manipulative seductress who used charm and intellect to control the most powerful men of her time? For more than 2,000 years, her name has carried the weight of fascination, scandal, and power. Cleopatra VII Philippa, the last pharaoh of Egypt, remains one of the most compelling figures in human history. She was a woman who ruled a world built for men, and somehow she left behind a legacy that still sparks debate, curiosity, and admiration. To many, Cleopatra is a symbol of beauty and passion, immortalized in art and film as a temptress who brought Rome to its knees. But behind the romanticized image lies a far more complex truth. She was a scholar, a strategist, a linguist, and a visionary queen who navigated a crumbling dynasty while standing toe-to-toe with the greatest empire on earth. Hers is not simply a story of love, it is a story of survival, ambition, and identity in an age of conquest. To understand Cleopatra, we must first understand her world. She was born in 69 BCE into the Ptolemaic dynasty, a line of Greek rulers descended from Ptolemy I Soter, one of Alexander the Great's generals. For nearly 3 centuries, the Ptolemies had ruled Egypt not as native Egyptians but as foreign monarchs who adopted the customs and symbols of pharaohs. They built temples, worshipped Egyptian gods, and presented themselves as divine rulers. Yet they spoke Greek, not Egyptian, and their court politics were steeped in Greek traditions. By the time Cleopatra was born, her dynasty was weakening. Corruption, greed, and family rivalries had fractured the once great empire. The Nile still flowed with the richness of life, and Alexandria remained a jewel of the Mediterranean, a city of marble palaces, bustling harbors, and the legendary Great Library. But Egypt's independence was under threat. Rome was growing stronger every year, spreading its influence across the ancient world. Kings and queens bent the knee to Rome, not out of loyalty, but out of fear. Cleopatra entered this turbulent world as the second daughter of Ptolemy XII Olewitz, a ruler more famous for his love of luxury than his skill at governance. Her father kept his throne only through constant payments to powerful Romans, draining Egypt's wealth to buy their protection. When he died, Cleopatra inherited not only his crown but his political debts. Most young women of her time were expected to marry, bear children, and remain silent in the affairs of state. Cleopatra refused that path. From an early age, she showed a fierce intelligence and curiosity about the world. She was well educated in mathematics, philosophy, astronomy, and medicine. Ancient sources tell us that she spoke several languages, perhaps 9 in total, including Egyptian, the language her ancestors had long ignored. That choice alone set her apart. It was a political statement as much as a cultural one. Cleopatra wanted to rule not just from the throne, but from the heart of her people. When her father died, Cleopatra was about 18. She was expected to rule alongside her younger brother Ptolemy XIII, who was barely a teenager. They were married, as tradition required, but their partnership quickly broke apart. Advisors around her brother conspired to drive her from power, spreading rumors and turning soldiers against her. Within a year, Cleopatra was forced to flee Alexandria. She retreated into exile, gathering what supporters she could in the deserts of Syria. Most rulers would have vanished at that point, another casualty of palace intrigue. Cleopatra, however, refused to surrender. She watched and waited. She understood that Egypt's fate was tied to the great power of Rome, and she was determined to use that knowledge to reclaim her throne. Then history placed her in the path of Julius Caesar. In 48 BCE, Caesar arrived in Alexandria, pursuing his rival Pompey during Rome's civil war. Cleopatra saw opportunity in his arrival. Unable to approach the palace openly, her brother's forces guarded every entrance. She devised one of the most daring acts of her life. According to legend, she had herself smuggled into Caesar's quarters, rolled in a carpet. When the carpet was unrolled, she appeared before him, unarmed, confident, and utterly composed. That moment changed everything. Caesar was astonished by her boldness. He saw in her not merely a deposed queen but a political ally and a woman of remarkable intellect. Cleopatra saw in him the key to her restoration. Their alliance, whether born of strategy, attraction, or both, reshaped the ancient world. With Caesar's military backing, Cleopatra defeated her brother's army on the banks of the Nile. Ptolemy XIII drowned while fleeing battle, and Cleopatra once again took the throne, now as sole ruler of Egypt. To solidify her position, She had her younger brother Ptolemy XIV named Corula, but it was clear that she alone held power. Her reign entered a golden moment. Cleopatra and Caesar spent several months together in Alexandria. They sailed the Nile, discussed philosophy and politics, and envisioned a new future for Egypt. She bore him a son, Caesarion, whom she proclaimed as her co-ruler and heir. For the first time in decades, Egypt's stability seemed within reach, but Cleopatra's relationship with Caesar also tied her fate to Rome's. When Caesar returned home and was later assassinated in 44 BCE, her carefully built world began to crumble once again. The Roman Republic fell into chaos, torn between Caesar's supporters and his enemies. In the struggle for power that followed, one man emerged as Caesar's successor, Mark Antony, one of Rome's greatest generals. Cleopatra understood that Egypt could not survive without choosing a side. She summoned Antony to meet her, not as a servant of Rome but as an equal. When she sailed to meet him on the Kidnus River, she arrived not as a supplicant queen but as a living goddess. Ancient writers describe her ship adorned with gold, her servants dressed as nymphs, the air perfumed with incense. Antony, known for his strength and pride, was captivated. Their meeting forged one of history's most famous partnerships, a union of politics and passion. Cleopatra and Antony became allies and lovers, bound by shared ambition. Together, they envisioned an empire that could rival Rome itself, with Alexandria as its shining capital. For Egypt, it was a moment of renewed power. For Rome, it was a scandal. To Antony's rival, Octavian, the future Emperor Augustus, Cleopatra was the perfect enemy. He painted her as a foreign temptress who had bewitched a Roman hero. He claimed Antony had betrayed his homeland for her, that she sought to rule the world through seduction and sorcery. This propaganda spread across Rome, turning public opinion against them. The inevitable war came in 31 BCE. At the Battle of Actium, Cleopatra and Antony's combined fleet faced Octavian's forces. The battle was fierce but short-lived. Surrounded and outmaneuvered, they fled back to Egypt. Their dream of a new empire was shattered. In Alexandria, with Octavian's armies closing in, Cleopatra made her final choices. Antony, believing her dead, fell on his sword. Mortally wounded, he was brought to her and died in her arms. Cleopatra, unwilling to live as a prisoner and paraded through Rome as a trophy, chose death on her own terms. According to tradition, she held a venomous asp to her breast, the serpent of royalty, and let it bite. With that act, the line of the pharaohs ended, and Egypt became a Roman province. Cleopatra was 39 years old. Her death marked not just the end of a dynasty, but the end of an era. For 3,000 years, the pharaohs had ruled the Nile. After Cleopatra, Egypt belonged to foreign emperors, yet her story refused to die. Over the centuries, she became more than a historical figure. She became an idea. To Roman poets, she was a cautionary tale, the dangerous woman who destroyed great men. To Renaissance painters, she was a symbol of tragic beauty. To modern historians, she stands as proof that women could wield power with intelligence and authority, even in a world that sought to silence them. What makes Cleopatra's story endure? Perhaps it is her defiance. She lived at the crossroads of two civilizations, Greek and Egyptian, Eastern and Western, and refused to be defined by either. She was both scholar and sovereign, both lover and leader. She understood that power is not only about armies and wealth, but about perception, persuasion, and will. Her life raises questions that still matter today. How do we define power? By conquest or by intellect? How does history remember women who lead? And how much of Cleopatra's legend is truth? And how much is the invention of those who feared her? The truth is that Cleopatra's legacy has been shaped by her enemies. Roman historians wrote her story through the lens of their own victory. They made her a symbol of decadence to justify their conquest. Yet, beneath their words, the outlines of the real Cleopatra remain, a ruler who restored stability to her kingdom, who revived trade and learning in Alexandria, and who dared to dream of independence in the face of empire. To her people, she was not a temptress but a pharaoh. She appeared before them dressed as Isis, the mother goddess, protector of the Nile. She performed ancient rituals, presided over festivals, and spoke to the Egyptian priests in their own language. She understood that to rule Egypt was to embody its spirit. Even in her final act, she maintained control over her own image. She chose death rather than humiliation. In doing so, she preserved her dignity and transformed herself into legend. Her tomb has never been found, but her presence lingers in every retelling, every painting, every whisper of her name. So, who was Cleopatra, truly? A queen fighting for her people, a strategist using every weapon at her disposal, a woman trapped between worlds. Perhaps she was all these things. Perhaps that is why she continues to fascinate us. 2,000 years later, her story still speaks to the timeless struggle between power and vulnerability, between myth and truth. She reminds us that history is not just written by victors, but by survivors, and Cleopatra, in every sense, survived through time. This is her story. The story of a woman who faced the greatest empire of her age and refused to disappear quietly. The story of intellect matched with courage, ambition entwined with destiny. Cleopatra, the last pharaoh, the queen of the Nile, the woman who turned history into legend. Before Cleopatra ascended the throne, Egypt was a land of beauty, brilliance, and deep uncertainty. The country that had once built pyramids, created one of the earliest writing systems, and inspired gods and kings across the ancient world, was no longer the powerful empire it had been. By the 1st century before Christ, Egypt's golden age was a distant memory. What remained was a proud but divided kingdom, wealthy in culture and history, yet fragile under foreign influence and internal decay. For nearly 3 centuries before Cleopatra's birth, Egypt had been ruled not by native pharaohs, but by Greek kings, the descendants of Ptolemy I Soter, a general under Alexander the Great. When Alexander died in 323 BCE, his vast empire fractured among his commanders. Ptolemy seized Egypt and established his dynasty in Alexandria, a city Alexander himself had founded. From that moment on, Egypt's rulers would speak Greek, follow Greek customs, and see themselves as heirs to both Alexander and the pharaohs. The Ptolemaic dynasty presented itself as divine. They wore the crowns of ancient Egypt, built temples to its gods, and commissioned statues showing themselves in the traditional poses of pharaohs. Yet behind this imagery, their rule was foreign. Greek became the language of power. Egyptian priests and local nobles still held influence, but the kingdom's wealth and decisions flowed from the royal palace in Alexandria, a glittering cosmopolitan city where Greek philosophers, mathematicians, and scientists gathered. Alexandria itself was unlike any city in the world. Its harbor teemed with ships carrying grain, papyrus, glass, and perfumes to every corner of the Mediterranean. The city's library, said to hold hundreds of thousands of scrolls, was the heart of ancient knowledge. Its towering lighthouse on the island of Pharos was one of the 7 wonders of the world. On the surface, Egypt appeared prosperous, even eternal. But beneath the surface, the cracks were widening. By the 2nd century BCE, the Ptolemies had grown weaker. Their court was notorious for intrigue, betrayal, and bloodshed. Brothers murdered brothers, sisters poisoned sisters, and power changed hands through deception more often than war. The dynasty had turned inward, more concerned with luxury and survival than leadership. While they fought among themselves, the world around them changed. To the west, a new force was rising: Rome. At first, Egypt had little to fear. Rome was still a republic, expanding cautiously, more focused on trade than conquest. But as Roman influence grew across the Mediterranean, no kingdom could ignore it. One by one, the Hellenistic states that had been founded after Alexander's empire crumbled or were absorbed into Roman control. Macedonia, Syria, and Greece itself fell under Roman rule. Egypt stood alone as the last major independent kingdom in the region. That independence came at a cost. The Ptolemies kept their crowns through alliances, bribes, and careful diplomacy. They paid Rome in gold, grain, and loyalty. Every year, Egypt's rich harvests fed Rome's armies and citizens. In return, Rome protected the dynasty, or, more accurately, kept it alive for as long as it served their interests. Egypt had become too valuable to destroy, but too weak to stand without Roman approval. By the time Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy XII Aliates, came to power, Egypt's sovereignty existed mostly on paper. He was a king in name but a client to Rome in reality. He secured his throne by paying enormous sums to Roman generals and senators. The people of Egypt resented him for it. They saw a ruler who drained the temples and taxed his people heavily to fund his bribes to foreigners. Riots and revolts became common. Ptolemy XII's reign was a portrait of the Ptolemaic decline, a desperate attempt to hold on to power through money and manipulation. When he was briefly deposed, he fled to Rome for help, offering yet more treasures in exchange for military support. The Romans restored him to the throne, but their intervention deepened Egypt's dependence. The royal family itself mirrored the kingdom's instability. The Ptolemies followed an unusual and often destructive custom. They married their own siblings to keep the royal bloodline pure. Over generations, this led to distrust, jealousy, and paranoia inside the palace. Every child was a potential rival, every relative a possible enemy. Assassinations were common. No one was safe, not even the throne's heirs. Into this volatile world, Cleopatra was born, the daughter of Ptolemy XII, and, most likely, one of his sisters or close relatives. Her exact lineage remains uncertain, but her future was anything but ordinary. From birth, she was surrounded by luxury and danger in equal measure. The palace walls of Alexandria glittered with gold, marble, and imported art, yet behind the opulence lay an undercurrent of fear. Cleopatra's childhood was shaped by the tension between Egypt's ancient identity and its foreign rulers. She grew up in a court where Greek philosophers debated politics and science, while Egyptian priests still worshipped Isis, Osiris, and the old gods. She would have been educated by Greek tutors, learning rhetoric, literature, and statecraft. But she also paid close attention to Egyptian religion and tradition, something her ancestors had largely ignored. While most Ptolemaic rulers distanced themselves from the native population, Cleopatra showed an early curiosity about her people. She learned the Egyptian language, a rare and politically significant act. Her ability to speak directly to priests, traders, and farmers set her apart from every ruler before her. It was a signal that she saw herself not only as a Greek queen on Egypt's throne, but as a true Egyptian monarch. The Egypt she would one day inherit was rich in spirit, but poor in strength. The country's fertile soil along the Nile remained its greatest asset, producing vast amounts of grain that Rome could not live without. Yet the kingdom's wealth made it a target. Its borders were weak, its army small, and its leaders unreliable. Rome's generals watched Egypt closely, waiting for the moment when it would collapse entirely. Even the Egyptian people, though proud of their heritage, had grown weary of their rulers. The Ptolemies, for all their grandeur, were seen as outsiders. Many Egyptians had little loyalty to the dynasty that taxed them harshly and spent fortunes on foreign pleasures. Yet they still revered the image of the pharaoh, the divine ruler who represented order and balance. Cleopatra would later understand that to win her people's loyalty, she had to revive that image. Before her rise, Egypt was a land on the edge, wealthy but weakened, proud but divided, ancient yet ruled by foreigners. It was a kingdom suspended between worlds, the old and the new, the Egyptian and the Greek, the independent and the enslaved. In that world of uncertainty, one young woman would emerge with the intelligence, courage, and determination to change Egypt's destiny. She would restore a sense of purpose to a fading dynasty, confront the power of Rome, and challenge the image that history would try to impose upon her. Before Cleopatra, Egypt was a jewel in decline. Under her, for a brief and brilliant moment, it would shine again. Cleopatra's early years shaped the woman who would one day rule Egypt and challenge Rome. She was born into a palace of wealth, but also one of danger, where loyalty was uncertain and every decision could mean life or death. From the beginning, Cleopatra learned that power came not only from birthright, but from intellect, adaptability, and courage. She was born in 69 BCE in Alexandria, the glittering capital of the Ptolemaic kingdom. Her full name, Cleopatra VII Philopator, meant the father-loving goddess. She belonged to a dynasty that had ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries, descendants of Greek conquerors who had built their empire on the foundation of ancient Egyptian civilization. Though she was of Macedonian Greek blood, Cleopatra would come to see herself as something far more complex, a bridge between cultures, a queen of both Greek and Egyptian worlds. The royal palace where she spent her childhood was one of the most magnificent in the ancient world. Alexandria was a city of art, learning, and luxury. Its marble streets glowed white under the sun, and ships from every corner of the Mediterranean crowded its great harbor. Scholars from Athens, Rhodes, and Babylon studied in its library, which held hundreds of thousands of scrolls. Philosophers, mathematicians, and poets met in its courtyards, debating the nature of the universe and the destiny of nations. This was the world that shaped Cleopatra's mind. Unlike many rulers who came before her, Cleopatra's education was not confined to royal ceremony. She was trained to think, to question, and to lead. From an early age, she showed a sharp memory and an insatiable curiosity. Her tutors were among the finest scholars in the Greek world, teaching her history, philosophy, rhetoric, and mathematics. She studied the works of Homer, Plato, and Aristotle, absorbing not just their knowledge but their ideas about politics, ethics, and human nature. She also learned astronomy, the science that had fascinated Egyptians for millennia. The Ptolemies had inherited a culture that looked to the stars for meaning, and Cleopatra was no exception. She studied the movements of the planets, the flooding patterns of the Nile, and the principles of geometry and medicine. Knowledge, to her, was a tool of power. But Cleopatra's most remarkable strength was her gift for languages. Ancient writers record that she spoke as many as 9 tongues. She was fluent in Greek, Egyptian, and several Near Eastern dialects. She could communicate with Ethiopians, Hebrews, Syrians, and Arabs without interpreters. That ability was not simply impressive, it was revolutionary. For centuries, the Ptolemaic kings had ruled Egypt without ever learning its native language. Cleopatra broke that tradition deliberately. She wanted to connect with her people directly, without the filter of advisors or translators. Speaking Egyptian was more than a skill. It was a statement of identity. When she addressed her subjects in their own tongue, she showed that she was not just a foreign queen on a borrowed throne. She was the living embodiment of Egypt's heritage, a ruler who understood its heart as well as its crown. In a time when women were expected to be silent, Cleopatra learned to command attention. The Greek philosophers she studied often dismissed women as weak or irrational, but she refused to accept that vision. She trained herself in the art of persuasion, mastering the rhythms of speech and the subtleties of expression. Her voice, ancient sources tell us, was captivating, low, confident, and persuasive. She could disarm her opponents not with beauty alone but with words that revealed intelligence and wit. Cleopatra's education was also political. The Ptolemaic court was a dangerous place, full of shifting alliances and ruthless ambition. She watched her elders plot against one another, saw siblings turn into enemies, and understood that survival required more than privilege, it required strategy. She learned early how to read people, how to flatter when necessary, and how to command when the moment demanded it. From her father Ptolemy XII, Cleopatra learned both what to do and what to avoid. He was a cautious, insecure ruler who relied heavily on Roman support, often at Egypt's expense. He spent lavishly to maintain his favor in Rome, selling the kingdom's independence piece by piece. Cleopatra saw how dependency weakened him, how fear eroded authority. She understood that a true ruler could not simply please others. She had to lead with confidence, even when surrounded by enemies. She also learned the value of image. The Ptolemies had long presented themselves as gods on earth, divine protectors of Egypt. Cleopatra would later use that tradition with extraordinary skill. By aligning herself with the goddess Isis, the mother, healer, and symbol of rebirth, she gave her rule spiritual legitimacy. But this insight came from her early education, where she studied Egypt's religion not as a foreign curiosity but as part of her own identity. In the palace, Cleopatra grew up alongside her siblings, including her brothers Ptolemy XIII and Ptolemy XIV, and her sister Arsinoe. Their relationships were complex and often dangerous. Every child of the royal line was both family and rival, a potential ally or enemy, depending on who held power. Cleopatra learned to navigate this environment with care, balancing loyalty with self-preservation. Even as a young woman, she displayed traits that distinguished her from her siblings. While others were content with the pleasures of court life, Cleopatra involved herself in matters of administration and governance. She asked questions about trade, taxation, and diplomacy, subjects few royal women dared to discuss. She wanted to understand how Egypt functioned, how power moved through its systems, and how she could one day shape it to her will. She also recognized the importance of Rome long before she ascended the throne. She saw its growing power, its wealth, and its ambition. She knew that Egypt's survival depended on understanding Rome, not just its politics but its people. While her father courted Roman officials with gifts, Cleopatra studied the Roman mind. She read their writers, learned their customs, and analyzed their ambitions. She would later use that insight to hold her own in the company of Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. There are no surviving records of Cleopatra's appearance from her youth, but ancient coins and busts suggest that her power came not from conventional beauty, but from presence. She carried herself with intelligence and confidence, aware that charisma was more enduring than physical perfection. She understood that perception could be shaped, and she learned how to shape it. By the time she reached her late teens, Cleopatra had become one of the most educated women of her age. Few men, even among Rome's elite, could match her depth of knowledge or her command of politics. She could discuss philosophy with scholars, debate strategy with generals, and recite poetry with ease. She was, in every sense, prepared for power, yet her education did not shield her from the realities of her dynasty. The Ptolemaic throne was not inherited peacefully, was seized, defended, and often lost through intrigue and betrayal. Cleopatra knew that her mind would be her greatest weapon. She would need to use everything she had learned: language, knowledge, charm, and cunning to survive. Her ambition was clear even before she became queen. She believed she could restore the dignity her ancestors had squandered. She envisioned an Egypt that was respected again, independent from Rome, led not by fear but by wisdom. Her intelligence was her armor, and her determination her guide. Cleopatra's early life and education forged a ruler unlike any before her. She was not a passive heir to a crumbling kingdom. She was a strategist being shaped by experience, preparing for the moment when history would call upon her. When that moment came, she was ready. The girl who had studied the stars would soon step into the center of the political universe. The scholar would become a queen. The student would become the last pharaoh of Egypt. Cleopatra's journey to the throne was not a simple inheritance of power, it was a battle for survival. When her father, Ptolemy XII Auletes, died in 51 BCE, the kingdom of Egypt stood at a crossroads. The once mighty land of the pharaohs had grown fragile, its future uncertain, its rulers more Greek than Egyptian, and its people burdened by the weight of foreign debts and Roman influence. Into this storm stepped Cleopatra, barely 18 years old, determined, intelligent, and ambitious. According to her father's will, Cleopatra was to rule jointly with her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, who was about 10 at the time. On paper, they were co-rulers, king and queen of Egypt. In reality, it was a dangerous arrangement. The Ptolemaic dynasty had a long history of family conflict, betrayal, and bloodshed. Brothers and sisters often plotted against each other for the throne, and Cleopatra quickly learned that the crown came with enemies, both within and beyond the palace walls. Cleopatra's early rule showed her natural leadership. She wanted to restore Egypt's power and stability, and unlike her predecessors, she embraced her Egyptian identity. She learned the Egyptian language, appeared before her people as the living goddess Isis, and worked to reconnect the throne with its ancient traditions. But her brother's powerful advisors saw her growing popularity as a threat to their control. Led by the ruthless eunuch Pothinus and the general Achilles, the young king's court turned against Cleopatra. They spread rumors that she was too ambitious, too independent, and too close to the common people. Within a few short years, the palace intrigue turned deadly. Cleopatra was forced to flee Alexandria, leaving her throne and her city behind. Exiled but not defeated, Cleopatra gathered loyal supporters and began to plan her return. She understood that Egypt's fate now depended not only on its internal struggles, but also on the politics of Rome, the rising superpower that already had its hand deep in Egyptian affairs. She watched closely as civil war broke out between Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great, two of Rome's most powerful men, knowing that their fight would shape her own destiny. In exile, Cleopatra's character was forged in hardship. She learned the value of patience, persuasion, and timing. She studied the movements of armies and the shifting tides of Roman politics, waiting for the moment when she could reclaim her crown. When Pompey fled to Egypt after his defeat at the Battle of Pharsalus, that moment arrived. His arrival would set off a chain of events that would bring Cleopatra face to face with Julius Caesar himself and change the course of her life forever. From the shadows of exile to the gates of Alexandria, Cleopatra was no longer just a princess struggling for power. She was becoming a force of history, a ruler ready to use every skill, every alliance, and every ounce of her intelligence to take back her throne and secure her legacy. Cleopatra's exile marked one of the most dangerous turning points in her life. Stripped of her crown and driven from the palace she had called home since childhood, she found herself on the edge of ruin. But Cleopatra was not a woman who surrendered to fate. Even in exile, she refused to accept defeat. She settled near the borders of Syria, far from the marble halls of Alexandria. but close enough to feel the pulse of her kingdom. There, she began to rebuild her power piece by piece. She gathered loyal followers, soldiers, advisors, and friends who still believed in her leadership. She understood that Egypt was not just a throne to sit on. It was a nation to protect, a heritage to preserve, and a people who needed strength, not submission. While her brother's court in Alexandria celebrated their supposed victory, the kingdom was collapsing from within. Corruption spread, taxes rose, and famine haunted the people. The child king, Ptolemy XIII, was a puppet controlled by his guardians, men more interested in wealth and influence than Egypt's survival. The country's relationship with Rome grew more complicated as powerful Romans demanded repayment of debts Cleopatra's father had left behind. The longer she stayed away, the clearer it became that Egypt needed her. Cleopatra began to play a dangerous game. She used diplomacy and charm to secure alliances, quietly raising an army in the eastern provinces. Each messenger she sent, each letter she wrote, was part of a larger plan, not just to return, but to rule completely. She knew the risk. Returning to Alexandria without the right moment, or the right ally, would mean death. But waiting too long could mean losing Egypt forever. Meanwhile, across the Mediterranean, the Roman world was in turmoil. Julius Caesar had defeated Pompey the Great in battle, and Pompey fled to Egypt seeking refuge. Cleopatra watched from afar as her homeland once again became a pawn in Rome's civil war. But when the Egyptian court betrayed Pompey, killing him in an attempt to gain Caesar's favor, the balance of power shifted dramatically. Caesar arrived in Alexandria furious over Pompey's death, and, suddenly, Cleopatra saw her chance. This was the moment she had been waiting for. She realized that to regain her throne, she needed more than soldiers. She needed influence at the heart of Rome's power. And Caesar was that key. Every instinct told her this was her opportunity to return not as a fugitive, but as a queen ready to reclaim her destiny. Cleopatra's journey from exile back to Alexandria was not just physical, it was psychological. She had transformed from a young, uncertain ruler into a master strategist who understood that power required courage, intelligence, and the ability to take calculated risks. Her plan was bold, even dangerous, but it would make her legend eternal. Soon, under the cover of night, she would set out to meet Caesar. History would remember what followed as one of the most daring acts of her life, and the moment when Cleopatra, the last pharaoh of Egypt, began her rise to greatness once again. The meeting between Cleopatra and Julius Caesar changed not only the course of Egyptian history, but also that of Rome and the entire Mediterranean world. It was a turning point born out of chaos, strategy, and daring courage. Cleopatra was no longer the exiled queen. She was a woman who understood the value of timing and the art of political survival. When Cleopatra learned that Caesar had arrived in Alexandria in 48 BCE, she saw an opportunity unlike any other. Caesar was already one of the most powerful men in the world, fresh from his victory over Pompey the Great, but he was also entering a dangerous situation. Egypt, though officially a Roman ally, was divided by civil war between Cleopatra and her brother Ptolemy XIII. The court was unstable, and tensions were rising in the streets. For Cleopatra, Caesar's presence offered more than protection. It was a chance to reclaim her throne and secure Egypt's independence under the shadow of Rome. But she faced one enormous obstacle. She couldn't simply walk into the palace. Her enemies controlled Alexandria, and her brother's advisors had made it clear that she would be captured or killed if she tried to return. Cleopatra needed to find a way to reach Caesar without alerting the guards or the hostile court around him. According to ancient historians, Cleopatra devised a daring plan that would become one of the most legendary moments in history. She secretly entered the palace by night, hidden inside a rolled-up carpet or a linen sack, carried by one of her loyal servants directly into Caesar's private chambers. When the servant unrolled the bundle before Caesar, out stepped Cleopatra, young, intelligent, and strikingly composed. Whether that story is entirely true or partly myth, it captures the boldness that defined her character. In that single act, Cleopatra showed Caesar and the world that she was not merely a queen seeking help, but a ruler who knew how to command attention and take risks. Caesar was immediately intrigued. At 52, he was a seasoned general and politician, accustomed to power and ambition. Yet in Cleopatra, he saw something rare, a woman who matched him in intellect and confidence. She spoke with precision, understanding both Egyptian and Roman politics. She presented her case not as a plea for mercy, but as a partnership and alliance between equals. She argued that her rule would bring stability to Egypt and serve Rome's interests better than the corrupt advisors who controlled her brother. Cleopatra's presence had a powerful effect on Caesar. He agreed to mediate between the siblings, summoning both Cleopatra and Ptolemy XIII to settle their dispute. But the plan quickly collapsed. When Ptolemy's followers realized that Caesar favored Cleopatra, open war broke out in the streets of Alexandria. The young king's forces laid siege to the palace where Caesar and Cleopatra were staying. It was a desperate and bloody conflict known as the Alexandrian War. For months, Cleopatra and Caesar fought side by side, trapped within the walls of the palace as enemy forces surrounded them. Supplies ran low, fires spread through parts of the city, and the fate of both Egypt and Rome hung in the balance. Yet Cleopatra remained calm and determined. She provided Caesar with crucial intelligence, guided him through the complexities of Egyptian politics, and used her deep knowledge of the land and people to their advantage. She was no passive partner. She was a strategist, a ruler, and a survivor. Eventually, Caesar's reinforcements arrived from Asia Minor, led by the skilled commander Mithridates of Pergamon. In a decisive battle near the Nile Delta, Ptolemy XIII's forces were defeated. The young king drowned in the river as he tried to flee, ending the civil war and securing Cleopatra's victory. Against all odds, she had reclaimed her throne not as a dependent of Rome, but as a queen whose intelligence and courage had earned her survival. Cleopatra's restoration to power marked the beginning of a new phase in her reign. Caesar stayed in Egypt for several months after the war, and during this time, their alliance deepened both politically and personally. Their relationship became the subject of fascination and scandal in Rome, but in Egypt it was celebrated as a symbol of renewal. In 47 BCE, Cleopatra gave birth to a son, Ptolemy XV, better known as Caesarion, meaning Little Caesar. His birth united the legacies of two great civilizations, Rome and Egypt. Cleopatra was careful in how she presented this new reality. She named Caesarion her Kurula, linking his lineage to both divine Egyptian blood and Roman power. But she also understood the dangers. In Rome, Caesar's political enemies viewed her as a threat, a foreign queen trying to influence their leader. Cleopatra's task was to balance loyalty to Caesar with the independence of Egypt, a delicate game that required every bit of her diplomatic skill. During Caesar's stay, Cleopatra took him on a grand journey along the Nile. Together, they visited temples, sacred sites, and the ancient cities of Upper Egypt. For Caesar, it was a chance to witness the grandeur of a civilization older than Rome itself. For Cleopatra, it was a calculated move away to remind him that Egypt was not a colony to be conquered, but a powerful kingdom with its own history and culture. She used her charm and intelligence not merely to seduce, but to educate and influence. Under Cleopatra's guidance, Egypt began to recover. She reformed the administration, stabilized the economy, and reopened trade routes that had been disrupted by years of civil conflict. The Nile once again flowed with prosperity, and the people saw in her a ruler who cared for their future. She appeared before her subjects as the living embodiment of Isis, the goddess of motherhood and magic, while maintaining her image as a modern monarch capable of navigating the politics of the Mediterranean world. When Caesar finally left Egypt to continue his campaigns, he left behind more than just a lover. He left a powerful ally who had proven her worth. Cleopatra had secured her throne, protected Egypt from annexation, and ensured her dynasty's survival through her son. She was now in her late 20s, at the height of her power, ruling with confidence and vision. Yet even in triumph, she knew her challenges were far from over. Her position was still fragile. Egypt's independence depended on Caesar's support, and the politics of Rome were as dangerous as the desert sands. In the eyes of many Romans, Cleopatra represented luxury, ambition, and foreign influence, qualities that both fascinated and threatened them. Still, Cleopatra refused to live in Caesar's shadow. She was not content to be remembered only as his companion. She was building something larger, legacy that combined Egyptian tradition with the realities of a Roman-dominated world. Through diplomacy, intellect, and vision, she transformed her relationship with Caesar into a political alliance that served Egypt's long-term survival. When she later visited Rome, she arrived not as a guest but as a queen. Her presence caused a sensation. Statues of her likeness were erected in Caesar's villa, and the people of Rome whispered about her beauty and influence. For the Roman elite, she was both admired and feared, a symbol of the East's allure, and a reminder that power was no longer confined to the Senate's marble halls. But history would not stand still. The same ambition that had brought Caesar and Cleopatra together would soon tear Rome apart. Caesar's rise to absolute power angered his enemies, and Cleopatra's presence only fueled their resentment. In 44 BCE, Caesar was assassinated, stabbed to death in the Senate, by men who claimed to be saving the Republic. When news reached Cleopatra, her world shifted again. Her protector, ally, and partner was gone. Yet even in grief, Cleopatra's mind turned to strategy. She had lost Caesar, but she still had Caesarion, her son, her symbol of legitimacy, her connection to Rome's greatest leader. With his birthright, she believed she could still secure Egypt's independence and shape its destiny. The path ahead would lead her into new alliances, new wars, and new heartbreaks. But for now, Cleopatra stood at the height of her reign. The Queen of the Nile, who had outwitted generals, survived exile, and won back her throne through brilliance and boldness. She had proven to the world that she was not just Caesar's lover, she was a ruler in her own right, a woman of vision and power who would not be forgotten. With her throne secure and Egypt finally at peace, Cleopatra began the most successful and stable period of her reign. For years, her life had been marked by conflict, betrayal, exile, and war. But now, she ruled as the undisputed Queen of Egypt. It was her chance to rebuild the kingdom, restore its wealth, and strengthen her people's faith in their ancient land. Cleopatra understood that Egypt needed more than a monarch who claimed divine blood. It needed a leader who could bring balance between tradition and modern power. The world around her was changing rapidly. Rome had become the dominant force in the Mediterranean, and no kingdom could ignore its influence. Yet Cleopatra was determined to preserve Egypt's independence, to keep it strong enough to stand on its own. Even while navigating the ambitions of Rome's most powerful men, her rule began with reform. The wars had left the economy strained, trade disrupted, and the treasury nearly empty. Cleopatra worked tirelessly to restore stability. She introduced new systems for collecting taxes, ensuring that wealth was distributed fairly and corruption reduced. She reopened trade routes along the Red Sea and across the eastern Mediterranean, forging new alliances with kingdoms and merchants who valued Egypt's grain, gold, papyrus, and spices. Under her leadership, Alexandria once again became a center of commerce, culture, and knowledge, the shining jewel of the ancient world. She also turned her attention to agriculture, the lifeblood of Egypt. The Nile's floods had long sustained her people, but years of instability had weakened farming systems. Cleopatra commissioned repairs to irrigation canals, supported farmers with loans from the royal treasury, and made sure grain prices stayed fair. These decisions strengthened the economy and won her the loyalty of the common people. She was not a distant ruler hidden behind palace walls. She was present, informed, and active in every corner of her government. Cleopatra's intelligence was not just administrative. She understood how symbols of power could shape perception. As pharaoh, she revived ancient Egyptian traditions that had been neglected under previous Greek rulers. She adopted the language, rituals, and iconography of Egypt's old dynasties, appearing before her people as the living embodiment of Isis, the goddess of motherhood, fertility, and magic. To the Egyptians, this was not simply theater, it was faith. Their queen was not only a ruler, she was divine, chosen by the gods to protect the Nile and the people who lived along its banks. At the same time, Cleopatra remained grounded in her Greek heritage. She maintained close connections to the intellectual and scientific circles of Alexandria. The city's famed library and scholars flourished under her patronage. She invited mathematicians, astronomers, and philosophers from across the Hellenistic world to teach and study in her court. She herself was highly educated, fluent in several languages, including Egyptian, Greek, Aramaic, and Latin. She discussed politics and philosophy with the same confidence as she negotiated trade or commanded armies. In a world ruled mostly by men, Cleopatra's intellect set her apart as both respected and feared. But even as she strengthened Egypt from within, Cleopatra never forgot the looming shadow of Rome. The Great Republic had become both her greatest threat and her greatest opportunity. Her alliance with Julius Caesar had ensured her return to power. Yet his death in 44 BCE left Egypt exposed once again to the turbulent politics of Rome. Rival generals and politicians, Mark Antony, Octavian, and others, now fought for control of Caesar's legacy and the Roman world. Cleopatra had to tread carefully. Any wrong move could turn her into an enemy of the next ruler of Rome. Rather than retreat into isolation, Cleopatra used diplomacy to secure Egypt's position. She sent envoys, offered grain shipments, and built relationships with influential Roman leaders. Her goal was clear: to keep Egypt independent while appearing as a loyal ally. She understood that open defiance of Rome would invite invasion, but total submission would erase her kingdom's identity. Walking that tightrope required political brilliance, and Cleopatra balanced it with skill that few rulers in history could match. During this period, she also turned her court into a center of splendor and sophistication. The royal palace in Alexandria became a symbol of power and prestige, decorated with art and architecture that reflected both Egyptian grandeur and Greek elegance. Visitors from foreign lands described Cleopatra's court as one of the most magnificent in the ancient world. But beneath the glittering marble halls and golden columns was a ruler who never lost sight of the practical needs of her people. Her leadership combined beauty and intellect, glamour and governance. Cleopatra's Egypt was not a stagnant kingdom frozen in the past. It was alive, evolving, and deeply connected to the wider world. She promoted trade with Arabia, Nubia, and India, encouraging the exchange of goods, ideas, and culture. Egyptian ships sailed across the Red Sea and the Mediterranean, carrying spices, glass, linen, and papyrus, symbols of the kingdom's prosperity. The taxes collected from this growing trade funded her military, infrastructure, and the cultural revival of her empire. In religion, Cleopatra carefully balanced the divine and the political. To her Egyptian subjects, she was the daughter of Isis, chosen by the gods to rule. To the Greeks and Romans, she presented herself as a capable monarch, worthy of equal respect. Her portraits and statues reflected this duality, sometimes shown in the traditional Egyptian style with the headdress of a goddess, and other times in the Hellenistic style of a learned queen. This dual image allowed her to bridge cultures and maintain her authority across a diverse population. Even as she projected power, Cleopatra knew that Egypt's security depended on more than wealth and image. She strengthened her navy, improved the kingdom's defenses, and kept a close watch on Rome's shifting alliances. She trained loyal commanders, ensuring that Egypt would never be caught unprepared again. Her leadership was a blend of wisdom and realism. Peace was precious, but only if defended with strength. For several years, Egypt thrived under her guidance. The Nile's floods were plentiful, trade flourished, and the arts and sciences reached new heights. Cleopatra's reign brought stability not seen in generations. Foreign ambassadors praised her wisdom, and scholars recorded her name with admiration. She was known not only for her beauty, as later myths would exaggerate, but for her eloquence, intelligence, and vision. Ancient writers said that her voice alone could persuade even the most stubborn listener, soft yet commanding, logical yet emotional, always aware of her audience. But despite these successes, Cleopatra could not fully escape the reality that Rome was growing stronger every year. Its leaders no longer spoke of alliances, they spoke of provinces. The Mediterranean was becoming a Roman lake, and Egypt, with its wealth and strategic importance, was too tempting to ignore. Cleopatra's reforms and diplomacy had delayed the inevitable clash, but she knew that sooner or later, she would have to choose sides in Rome's next civil war. Still, she did not rule through fear, she ruled through purpose. Cleopatra saw herself as the protector of Egypt's soul, the last true pharaoh in a world where ancient traditions were fading. Her reign was a renaissance, a revival of Egypt's glory in its final age of independence. She rebuilt temples, restored the worship of old gods, and funded massive construction projects across the Nile Valley. Under her command, the people saw hope again, a belief that Egypt's greatness had not ended. Cleopatra's image spread far beyond her borders. Traders, diplomats, and travelers carried stories of the young queen who defied expectations and ruled with both wisdom and charisma. To her people, she was a living goddess. To Rome, she was an enigma, a ruler too intelligent to control, too proud to surrender, and too powerful to ignore. As Egypt flourished, Cleopatra watched the distant storms gathering over Rome. The assassins who killed Caesar had been defeated, but new rivalries emerged. The Roman Republic was dying, torn apart by ambition and vengeance. Cleopatra understood that Rome's next war would decide not just who ruled the Republic, but whether Egypt would remain free or become another province of an empire. In the midst of peace, she began to prepare, quietly, strategically. She strengthened alliances, expanded her fleet, and ensured that her son, Caesarion, would grow into a leader capable of carrying her legacy. Her reign was calm on the surface, but beneath it lay the awareness of danger. She had built a reborn Egypt, but she also knew that history rarely allowed peace to last forever. For now, Cleopatra stood as one of the most powerful women the world had ever known, a queen who ruled through intelligence, charm, and will. She had turned a kingdom torn by war into a nation of prosperity and pride. Yet, as Rome's new leaders, Mark Antony and Octavian, began to shape the future of the empire, Cleopatra's destiny was already being written once more in the shifting sands of politics and power. Her story was far from over. Egypt was reborn, but new storms were coming. And soon, Cleopatra would face the greatest test of her reign, one that would define her legend for centuries to come. The death of Julius Caesar left the ancient world in chaos. His assassination in 44 BCE shattered the fragile balance of power and set off a brutal struggle for control of Rome. Cleopatra, now an experienced ruler and mother to Caesar's son, Caesarion, watched from Alexandria as the Roman world once again descended into civil war. The man who had once protected her was gone, and with his death came uncertainty. She had to decide whom to trust and how to keep Egypt safe from Rome's endless hunger for dominance. From this turmoil emerged a new figure, Mark Antony, one of Caesar's closest allies and one of Rome's most brilliant generals. Antony was bold, charismatic, and ambitious, with a reputation for both military genius and reckless indulgence. After Caesar's death, he formed a political alliance with Octavian, Caesar's adopted son, and Lepidus, creating what became known as the Second Triumvirate, a three-man dictatorship meant to restore order. But peace in Rome never lasted long, and soon, power and loyalty began to fracture. Antony took control of the eastern provinces of the Roman world, a region that included Greece, Asia Minor, and the lands bordering Egypt. His mission was to stabilize Rome's eastern territories and secure support against its enemies. Cleopatra, ruling from Alexandria, understood what that meant. Egypt was not just another kingdom, it was the jewel of the East, rich in grain, gold, and influence. For Antony, gaining Cleopatra's cooperation was essential. For Cleopatra, gaining Antony's alliance could determine Egypt's survival. Their meeting in 41 BCE was legendary. Antony summoned Cleopatra to meet him in Tarsus, a city in modern-day Turkey, to explain why she had not supported Rome after Caesar's death. Many rulers feared Antony, but Cleopatra knew that fear would only weaken her position. Instead, she chose to make her entrance unforgettable. Sailing up the Kidnus River, Cleopatra appeared aboard a magnificent barge decorated in gold and purple. Perfume filled the air, and the scent of incense carried across the water. She reclined beneath a canopy dressed as the goddess Isis, surrounded by attendants dressed as cupids and nymphs. Musicians played soft melodies as her ship glided toward the shore. The people of Tarsus lined the riverbanks in awe, whispering that Aphrodite herself had come to meet Dionysus. It was not just an arrival, it was a statement of power, beauty, and confidence. Antony, known for his own love of spectacle, was captivated. When Cleopatra stepped ashore, their connection was immediate. She spoke with eloquence and purpose, blending charm with intellect. She reminded him that Egypt had always been Rome's ally, and that her only desire was stability and peace. But beneath her diplomacy was strategy. Cleopatra saw in Antony what she had once seen in Caesar, a man whose ambition could protect Egypt, at least for a time. Their alliance quickly deepened into romance, though it was far more than love alone. Cleopatra and Antony understood each other's ambitions. He sought resources and legitimacy in the East. She sought protection and influence in Rome. Together, they envisioned an empire that could rival Rome itself, union of East and West, built on strength, wealth, and destiny. Antony followed Cleopatra back to Alexandria, where he was welcomed as a hero. The Egyptian people, still devoted to Cleopatra, saw in Antony a powerful ally. Together, they began to build what some historians call the Alexandrian dreamer vision of a new world order where Rome and Egypt ruled side by side. For Antony, Egypt offered the wealth and culture that Rome's wars had drained. For Cleopatra, Antony represented the military force that could keep her kingdom free. Their partnership soon became legendary. They hosted lavish feasts, organized grand ceremonies, and created a royal court that blended Egyptian tradition with Roman luxury. Cleopatra was at the height of her power, and Antony, often dressed in Egyptian garb, seemed content to rule by her side. To their followers, they appeared as living gods, Cleopatra, as Isis, Antony, as the new Dionysus. Together, they presented themselves as divine rulers destined to reshape the world. Yet their relationship was not only built on indulgence. Cleopatra used her influence to secure political and economic stability for Egypt. She provided Antony with funds, ships, and supplies for his campaigns, strengthening her position as a crucial ally. Antony, in turn, granted her control over several territories that once belonged to Egypt, expanding her borders and influence. Their union was as strategic as it was personal, a calculated partnership of love and power. But in Rome, whispers turned to outrage. Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir and Antony's rival, began to spread rumors that Antony had fallen under Cleopatra's spell, that he had abandoned Roman honor for Eastern decadence. Roman senators, already uneasy about the growing influence of foreign monarchs, saw Cleopatra as a dangerous threat. To them, she was not a queen protecting her nation, but a seductress manipulating one of Rome's most powerful men. Antony, however, remained loyal to Cleopatra. He returned to Rome briefly, married Octavian's sister Octavia in a political gesture of peace, but soon went back to Egypt, unable or unwilling to sever his bond with Cleopatra. The marriage was a facade. His heart and loyalty remained in Alexandria. There, Cleopatra gave birth to their children twins, Alexander, Helios, and Cleopatra Selene, and later a third son, Ptolemy, Philadelphus. Together, they built a dynasty that symbolized their dream of uniting East and West. In 34 BCE, after a successful campaign in Armenia, Antony staged a grand celebration in Alexandria, known as the Donations of Alexandria. Before a massive audience, he declared Cleopatra Queen of Kings and Caesarion, her son with Julius Caesar, as King of Kings. He distributed territories across the eastern Mediterranean to their children, presenting them as future rulers of a vast empire. The ceremony was meant to showcase unity and prosperity, but in Rome, it was seen as treason. Octavian seized the opportunity to turn public opinion against Antony. He accused him of betraying Rome, of placing Egypt and Cleopatra above his own people. The image of Cleopatra as a foreign temptress corrupting a Roman general became powerful propaganda. Octavian claimed that Antony intended to move the capital of the empire from Rome to Alexandria, to make himself a king and Cleopatra a queen over the Roman world. Whether true or not, the accusation worked. The Roman Senate declared war not on Antony, but on Cleopatra. In Alexandria, Cleopatra understood the danger. She had faced political storms before, but this was unlike any other. Rome's full might was preparing to strike, and this time, it was personal. Yet she did not retreat or surrender. She prepared her fleets, strengthened her defenses, and stood beside Antony as his equal. The dream they had built, the dream of an empire ruled by love, power, and unity, was now being tested by the harsh reality of Roman ambition. Cleopatra and Antony had become symbols of a world divided. To their supporters, they were visionaries, rulers of unmatched charisma and courage, standing against the greed of Rome. To their enemies, they were dangerous, decadent, and doomed. The stage was set for the final confrontation that would decide not only their fates, but the future of Egypt itself. As Cleopatra looked out over the waters of the Mediterranean, she must have known that the tide was turning. Rome was coming, and this time, it would not be content to share the world. The love that had once united two great powers was about to bring them both to the brink of destruction. The dream that Cleopatra and Mark Antony built in Alexandria had grown too large for Rome to ignore. What began as a powerful alliance between two rulers was now seen as a threat to the entire Roman world. In Rome, Octavian, Caesar's adopted son, watched Antony's growing attachment to Cleopatra with cold suspicion. To him, Antony was no longer a Roman hero. He was a man bewitched by a foreign queen, consumed by Eastern luxury, and ready to betray the Republic. Octavian understood that power was not just taken by force, it was won through image and persuasion. He began a calculated campaign of propaganda, one of the most effective in ancient history. Letters, speeches, and coins carried his message across the Roman world. He portrayed Cleopatra as a dangerous enchantress who had enslaved Antony's mind and turned him against his homeland. Rome's greatest general, Octavian claimed, now served a queen who called herself a goddess. To Roman ears, it sounded like treason. He told the Senate that Antony had promised the Roman provinces to Cleopatra and her children, that he planned to move the empire's capital from Rome to Alexandria, and that he had even begun to dress as an Egyptian and worship foreign gods. Whether these claims were exaggerated or not didn't matter, the story worked. Public opinion turned sharply against Antony. The Roman people, already wary of war, now saw Cleopatra as the reason their empire was in danger. Meanwhile, in Alexandria, Cleopatra and Antony prepared for the inevitable. They understood that diplomacy had failed, that Rome would not rest until Egypt was brought under its control. But neither ruler was willing to surrender. Cleopatra still believed that Egypt could remain independent, and Antony, once Rome's greatest general, was not ready to bow before Octavian's ambition. Together, they gathered their forces, hundreds of ships, thousands of soldiers, and all the wealth of Egypt. Cleopatra personally financed much of the war, providing gold, supplies, and ships. Antony took command of their joint forces, and the two established their base in Greece, near the Gulf of Ambrosia, where they would face Octavian's fleet. But Octavian was not only a soldier, he was a master strategist. He placed his trusted general Marcus Agrippa in charge of his navigaman, known for discipline and skill. Agrippa's forces were smaller in number, but they were better organized, faster, and supplied by Rome's powerful ports. In 31 BCE, the two sides finally met in one of history's most famous naval battles, the Battle of Actium. The sea was calm that morning, but beneath its still surface lay the tension of empires. Antony's fleet, large and heavily armed, stretched across the horizon. Cleopatra's flagship, adorned in royal colors, stood near the center. She refused to remain in Egypt. She would face Rome's wrath beside Antony. For hours, the two forces stared each other down. The wind shifted, oars cut through the waves, and the battle began. Roman galleys, swift and disciplined, moved in tight formation. Antony's ships were massive but slow, designed for intimidation rather than speed. As the clash erupted, the air filled with shouts, the crash of rams, and the smoke of burning oil. Antony's forces began to falter. Agrippa's strategy was ruthless: cut off supplies, break formation, and drive panic into the enemy lines. Cleopatra's fleet, stationed behind Antony's, waited for the right moment to strike. But as the battle turned chaotic, she saw that the Roman navy was closing in. Realizing the fight was lost, Cleopatra made a desperate decision. She ordered her ships to break away and flee south, back toward Egypt. Seeing her sails retreat, Antony's heart sank. In that instant, emotion overcame strategy. Abandoning the battle, he broke from the fight and followed her. His soldiers, left leaderless, fell into confusion. One by one, Antony's ships were captured or destroyed. By the end of the day, Rome had won. The Battle of Actium was over, and with it, the last hope of an independent Egypt began to fade. When Antony and Cleopatra returned to Alexandria, the city welcomed them with loyalty, but also with fear. They both knew what Actium Mentrum would come for them next. Still, Cleopatra refused to give up. She began preparing her defenses, gathering her remaining forces, and trying once again to negotiate peace. She sent envoys to Octavian, offering to abdicate the throne if it would save her children. But Octavian was unmoved. He wanted Egypt, and he wanted Cleopatra brought to Rome not as a queen, but as a prisoner. For Antony, the defeat shattered his spirit. Once Rome's greatest warrior, he was now hunted by the empire he had served. He withdrew into isolation, plagued by guilt and despair. Cleopatra tried to restore his confidence, reminding him of their shared vision and the legacy they had built together. But the man who had once commanded legions was broken. The rumors from Rome that Octavian was calling him a coward, that his army had turned against him, cut deep. In the months that followed, Antony's loyalty and Cleopatra's courage were tested again and again. Octavian's legions marched into Egypt in 30 BCE, unstoppable and disciplined. They advanced toward Alexandria, crushing any resistance along the way. Cleopatra tried one last act of diplomacy, sending messages to Octavian, offering peace and wealth in exchange for her throne. But Octavian wanted only one thing: total victory. The walls of Alexandria trembled under the weight of Rome's approach. Antony gathered what remained of his loyal soldiers and prepared for a final stand. The once great couple, who had dreamed of ruling the world, now faced their end in the city that had seen their greatest triumphs. The fall of Egypt was no longer just a political conflict. It was the death of an age. The pharaoh's line, stretching back thousands of years, was about to end. The Nile, which had witnessed the rise of dynasties and the building of pyramids, now flowed silently beside a kingdom about to disappear beneath Rome's shadow. Antony and Cleopatra had fought not just for power, but for an idea, the belief that Egypt could remain free, that love and loyalty could stand against empire. But Rome's hunger was endless, and Octavian's ambition unstoppable. The war was no longer about soldiers or ships, it was about who would write the final chapter of history. As Octavian's banners rose outside Alexandria, Cleopatra stood on her palace balcony, looking toward the sea that had once brought her Caesar and Antony, now filled with Roman ships. The dream she had built of a reborn Egypt, of unity, of love stronger than politics, was fading. The fall had begun, but Cleopatra was not done yet. In her mind, she was still the daughter of pharaohs, the living goddess of Egypt, and even in defeat, she would choose her own fate. The walls of Alexandria were quiet now. The great city that had once glittered with power, wealth, and culture stood under the shadow of Roman banners. The sound of marching soldiers echoed through the streets as Octavian's legions entered the capital. The once mighty Egyptian fleet lay in ruins, and its defenders, those who had remained loyal to Cleopatra and Antony, were scattered or dead. The war was over. Rome had won. In the heart of the royal palace, Cleopatra stood surrounded by silence. The rooms that had once hosted grand feasts and political councils were now filled with despair. She knew that Egypt had fallen not because her people had lost their courage, but because the tide of empire could not be stopped. Octavian, the man who would soon become Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, had conquered not only her armies but her destiny. For Mark Antony, the defeat was unbearable. The soldier who had once commanded legions and conquered kingdoms could not accept life as a captive of his enemies. In his final hours, Antony's spirit broke completely. Believing false reports that Cleopatra had taken her own life, he drew his sword and fell upon it. When Cleopatra's servants found him still clinging to life, they carried him to her. In one of history's most haunting moments, Cleopatra held Antony in her arms as he died. The man who had shared her dreams, her victories, and her downfall, now lay lifeless beside her. According to ancient sources, Antony told her not to grieve, but to trust in her courage. He begged her to make peace with Octavian, but Cleopatra knew that peace with Rome would never mean freedom. After Antony's death, Octavian moved quickly to secure the palace. He wanted Cleopatra alive, not to honor her, but to display her in Rome as proof of his victory. He had paraded kings and queens before, and Cleopatra, the woman Rome had feared and vilified, would be his greatest prize. But Cleopatra was not a woman who accepted humiliation. For years, she had ruled as a goddess on earth, a descendant of pharaohs. To be paraded through the streets of Rome in chains was unthinkable. Even in defeat, she intended to control her fate. When Octavian entered her palace, Cleopatra tried to negotiate one last time. She received him dressed in her royal robes, seated on her golden throne, her eyes steady and defiant. She reminded him that Egypt had once been a friend to Rome, that she had not sought war but survival. Octavian listened politely, but his mind was already made up. He told her that she would be taken to Rome. That single word sealed her decision. Cleopatra withdrew to her private chambers, guarded by loyal attendants. According to legend, she spent the next hours preparing for death, with the same grace she had once prepared for rule. She bathed, dressed in her finest robes, and adorned herself with her royal jewels. Around her, the walls of her palace shimmered with gold, and the faint scent of lotus, the perfume of Egypt's queens. No one knows for certain how Cleopatra ended her life. The most famous story tells that she arranged for a basket of figs to be brought to her, concealing within it a small asp, a venomous Egyptian snake. As she reached into the basket, the serpent bit her arm, and within moments, the poison began to work. Other accounts claim that she drank a deadly mixture of herbs and toxins prepared by her physicians. Whatever the method, what mattered most was her intent. Cleopatra chose to die as a queen, not as a captive. She met death on her own terms, calm, dignified, and resolute. When Octavian's guards finally broke into her chamber, they found her lifeless on her golden couch, dressed in royal splendor. At her feet lay her two most loyal servants, Iris and Charmian, who had followed her into death. The serpent, it is said, still coiled at her side. Octavian was stunned. His greatest enemy had denied him his final triumph. He had wanted to display her in his victory parade, but Cleopatra had stolen that victory in the only way she could, by choosing her own ending. Her death marked the end of more than a life. It was the end of an era, the end of pharaonic Egypt, a civilization that had lasted for over 3,000 years. With Cleopatra's passing, Egypt became a Roman province, ruled by foreign governors instead of kings and queens. The Nile, once the lifeblood of an independent empire, now flowed under the control of Rome. But Cleopatra's story did not end with her death. In Rome, she became legend. Poets, historians and artists could not stop writing about her. To some, she was a villain, manipulative temptress who brought down great men. To others, she was a tragic heroine, a woman of unmatched intelligence and courage who dared to defy the greatest power in the world. Even centuries later, her image continued to captivate. She was remembered not only for her beauty, as so many have simplified her story, but for her mind, her will, and her ability to rule in a world that belonged to men. Cleopatra had mastered politics, diplomacy, and the art of survival. She had faced Rome at its peak and nearly won. Her death, by poison or by snakebite, became a symbol of resistance, the final act of a queen who refused to kneel. As ancient writers described her lying in state, serene and radiant, they noted that she looked not defeated, but victorious. For in that final choice, Cleopatra ensured that her story would never belong to Rome. It would belong to history. From the sands of Egypt to the palaces of Europe, her legend has endured for 2,000 years. Her name still evokes the power and mystery of the Nile, the brilliance of a woman who dared to dream of empires, and the tragedy of a love that defied the world. Cleopatra's reign ended in death, but her spirit never faded. She remains the last pharaoh of Egypt, the queen who turned her fall into immortality. More than 2,000 years have passed since Cleopatra drew her final breath in that quiet chamber of her palace, yet her name still echoes through history. Few figures from the ancient world have captured the imagination of so many generations, and even fewer women have commanded such fascination, respect, and controversy. Cleopatra's legacy did not die with her. It began there. When Rome took Egypt, Octavian tried to erase her from memory. He ordered her images destroyed, her name tarnished. To him, she was not a queen but a dangerous symbol, the last challenge to Roman domination. Yet even the might of the empire could not silence her story. The very empire that sought to bury her ended up preserving her memory in its own writings. Ironically, we know much of Cleopatra today through the words of her enemies, Roman historians who described her as cunning, manipulative, and seductive. But behind their bias, the outline of a far greater woman emerges, intelligent, cultured, and proud. Cleopatra was the last pharaoh of Egypt, the final ruler of a dynasty that had lasted for nearly 300 years. She stood at the edge of an era, between the old world of the pharaohs and the rising age of empire. Her death marked the end of Egyptian independence, but her life marked the beginning of a legend that no conqueror could destroy. The afterlife of a queen as centuries passed, Cleopatra transformed from a historical figure into a timeless icon. Her story was retold again and again, reshaped to reflect each generation's dreams and fears. In the Middle Ages, European writers painted her as a cautionary tale, a woman whose beauty led great men astray. But during the Renaissance, she became something else, the embodiment of passion, intelligence, and power. Artists were fascinated by her courage. In death, the queen who chose her own end rather than bow to Rome. Painters across Europe captured her final moment, often with the asp at her breast, her eyes calm and defiant. To them, Cleopatra was not a fallen woman, but a sovereign who chose dignity over humiliation. William Shakespeare later gave her voice and fire in his play Antony and Cleopatra. His Cleopatra was human, proud, emotional, unpredictable, and deeply alive. Through his words, she became a woman of complexity, not a mere symbol. Shakespeare's Cleopatra could love, grieve, command, and laugh all in a single scene. For the first time, the world saw her not just as an Egyptian queen, but as a complete person, flawed yet magnificent. From the stage, Cleopatra moved to the screen. In the 20th century, Hollywood rediscovered her story. The 1963 film Cleopatra, starring Elizabeth Taylor, turned her into a global icon of beauty and power. The film itself became legendary, not just for its grandeur and cost, but for how it reimagined Cleopatra as both ruler and woman, strategist and lover. Audiences were drawn to her charisma, her ambition, her refusal to yield. Taylor's Cleopatra brought the queen to life for a new generation, and once again, the world fell under her spell. Since then, countless documentaries, novels, and dramas have tried to capture her mystery. Each version shows a different Cleopatra, the temptress, the patriot, the scholar, the mother. But maybe that's what makes her immortal. She can be all of them and more. Cleopatra is a mirror through which every age reflects its own idea of power, leadership, and femininity. The real Cleopatra behind the myths, when we look past the legends and the romance. What remains is a remarkable woman who ruled one of the greatest civilizations in history during its most dangerous time. She wasn't simply beautiful, she was brilliant. Cleopatra spoke at least 7 languages. She studied mathematics, philosophy, astronomy, and politics. While other rulers depended on advisors, she read and reasoned for herself. Ancient sources describe her as a skilled diplomat who could charm, persuade, and command with equal ease. As queen, she navigated a world dominated by men, generals, senators, and emperors, and yet she stood among them as an equal. She negotiated directly with Caesar. She held her throne through strategy, not seduction. She rebuilt Egypt's economy, strengthened its navy, and restored its temples. Her rule brought stability to a nation on the edge of collapse. Cleopatra understood that to protect Egypt, she needed alliances with Rome's most powerful men. Her relationships with Julius Caesar and later Mark Antony were not just romantic, they were political. She used diplomacy to secure Egypt's independence for nearly 2 decades after other kingdoms had already fallen. For a time, she succeeded a single queen standing between Egypt and empire. How history remembers her, but history is not always kind to women in power. After her death, Roman writers rewrote her story to fit their narrative. To justify their conquest, they painted her as a seductress who destroyed great men. They reduced her intellect to charm and her leadership to manipulation. In truth, these were the words of victors shaping the memory of the defeated. For centuries, their version endured. Yet despite their efforts, Cleopatra's greatness continued to shine through. Modern historians have slowly uncovered the truth beneath the myths. A ruler who led with strategy, courage, and intelligence. She wasn't a shadow behind powerful men. She was a leader who shaped her own destiny in a world determined to control her. Cleopatra's story challenges how we see power itself. She reminds us that leadership is not only about conquest or dominance, but vision, the ability to hold a nation together through intellect and will. Her reign may have ended, but her influence never did. Cleopatra in art, culture, and the modern mind today. Cleopatra's image is everywhere, in films, books, fashion, and even music. She's been painted as a goddess, sung about as a lover, and portrayed as a symbol of resilience. Her story has been told in dozens of languages and reimagined in every art form. From ancient scrolls to digital screens, Cleopatra remains alive. Artists continue to be drawn to her duality, beauty and power, love and ambition, life and death. She represents both the mystery of ancient Egypt and the universal struggle of a human being trying to control her fate. In many ways, she was the first global celebrity. The fascination she inspires is proof that charisma, intelligence, and courage can outlive any empire. And while Rome triumphed militarily, Cleopatra triumphed in memory. Octavian became Augustus and founded the Roman Empire, but his fame dimmed beside the queen he tried to erase. Today, Cleopatra's name still evokes wonder. Augustus is remembered mostly through her story. Why Cleopatra still matters. Cleopatra's legacy isn't just about ancient history. It speaks to us today about leadership, identity, and the way history remembers women who dare to lead. She was misunderstood, judged, and misrepresented, yet her brilliance continues to outshine the lies told about her. In an age when power often came from armies, Cleopatra's greatest weapon was her mind. She proved that intellect could command as strongly as force. She used knowledge, culture, and diplomacy to hold her throne for 2 decades in a time of chaos. Her reign was proof that leadership could be strategic and human at the same time. Even now, Cleopatra remains an inspiration to people who refuse to be defined by others. Her life teaches that being underestimated can be turned into strength, that vision and courage can outlast every empire. To me, Cleopatra's story is more than a chapter in history. It's a lesson in resilience. She lived in a world where everything was against her: politics, gender, empire. Yet she never surrendered. She fought for her country, for her people, and for her name to live on. And she succeeded. When I think of Cleopatra, I don't just see a queen surrounded by gold and temples. I see a woman standing alone against the tide of history, determined to write her own fate. Her courage, intelligence, and confidence remind us that greatness isn't given, it's earned, often in the hardest way possible. She reminds us that legacy is not measured by victory or defeat, but by how long your story continues to be told. And 2,000 years later, we're still talking about Cleopatra. That says it all. Cleopatra may have died, but her legend never did. She continues to reign, not over a kingdom of sand and stone, but over imagination itself. Every time her name is spoken, every time a new artist paints her or a filmmaker retells her story, she rises again from history's tomb. The Nile has long since changed its course. The palaces of Alexandria have turned to ruins beneath the sea. Yet Cleopatra's spirit remains proud, eternal, and unforgettable. Her story proves that memory is the true empire, and in that empire, Cleopatra still reigns as the immortal queen. Thank you for watching and joining me on this journey through the life of Cleopatra, a woman whose brilliance, courage, and complexity continue to inspire the world. Her story reminds us that history is never just about the past. It's about the choices, the dreams, and the strength that define us all. If you enjoyed this journey through history, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories from the ancient world. Your support helps keep history alive, one story at a time.